Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Veracious Show. My name's Lauren Risley. I'll be your host for this installment. A lot going on in my life. I'm lying. There's not all going on in my life. I'm producing content for my other channel, Halcyon, which if you're already a subscriber, thank you very much for coming and checking out Veracious, and if you're not, go and check out Halcyon. This is going to be a slightly smaller edition of the Veracious Show. Usually I go 20-30 minutes. Fortunately, there's not really a tremendous amount going on in the world that's worth talking about in my eyes at the moment, because I've already spoken about the balance of arguments and having a well-rounded opinion and a couple of controversial topics and a couple of personal experiences, blah, blah, blah. What I want to talk about in this episode is the importance of trying to listen. It's kind of a broad spectrum term, so let me try and quantify it for you. So recently, I've had a couple of conversations with another content creator, gentleman who is very passionate about what he does. Occasionally, will go into the foray into things that don't really concern him, and he goes into it to basically entertain me, I guess. What I found was that in our conversations, there were times I had to remind myself, calm yourself. Listen, actually engage with him. Don't just take your points and think just by ramming them down his throat he's going to see the perspective. And even if he does see your perspective, he still might not necessarily agree with it. Doesn't matter how well you explain your point. Doesn't necessarily mean he still thinks it has any validation. This made me review a couple of arguments or disagreements or debates that I had recently with people. And I think the reason why I want to touch on it is this. I've become guilty of something that I think I haven't really talked about a lot, but I may have touched on it once or twice, and it's certainly something I've encountered a lot. The ability to be able to listen and take on board what someone is saying, to admit when you have a point, but also to see when other people have their points as well. I think we all want to be right. No one likes to be wrong, and certainly when the prospect of being wrong means that it invalidates everything else you say, people aren't willing to give an inch. I think people need to reevaluate their stance when it comes to this, because I think that we can all be wrong from time to time. I think we can all admit that occasionally we've said something out of term, or we've not looked into something yet had a staunch opinion on it, and it's come back to bite us in the ass, and more importantly, it's led to situations where people have then discounted our opinion wholesale, which doesn't really lend itself well to good conversation, because if we dismissed everybody who'd ever said something that they weren't qualified to talk about, you'd be having a conversation with yourself, and that wouldn't be any fun. Over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten increasingly involved with those kinds of conversations with certain people. The most recent being with I would imagine he's disabled. I don't know too much. The debate centered around Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's role in Skyscraper, I believe it's called, a movie where he plays an amputee who has a prosthetic leg. From what I understand, the character wasn't originally designed with that in mind, but it was at The Rock's suggestion, considering he has a charity he represents for disabled people, and he wants to use that to propagate a disabled hero of sorts, which is great. I enjoyed it. The outrage centered around mainly people who thought that he was taking that role away from someone who is disabled. See, the thing I had a similar issue with that as I did with the transgender debate, but the difference being there, I guess, was that people were attacking him for being quote-unquote ableist, which is a term I'm still not 100% sure about, and the response I got from the gentleman was, again, fairly snarky and fairly dismissive, when, in honesty, I would have expected a slightly more mature response, but then again, maybe reviewing my own stance, maybe, I don't know, going after someone directly and questioning their beliefs directly is something you can't really do anymore, because that calls into question your ability to be able to maintain a unbiased view. Why do I say this? Well, in my conversations with this particular gentleman, it became apparent that almost having an opinion on the matter is somewhat, it dissuades conversation. People who are in the positions to have the conversation in the first place are the only people that should be talking, I guess. And that's discouraging to me, because I feel like, well, okay, so the idea being that because I'm privileged enough to be a certain colour, to be a certain gender, to be from a certain background and have a certain political, religious or sexual preference, that means I therefore have no dog in the fight, but that also means that I have no opinion worth listening to. It brings me back to a time where I used to be bullied a lot. And why do I bring this up? Because it's disheartening to be categorized and labeled and put in a box and told you don't count for whatever reason. Now, this might sound overly dramatic, especially from those who know me. I'm a pretty staunch defender of things. I get hot at people all the time. I get angry, and if I'm correct, I'm probably going to suffer the consequences of one of my angry outbursts at some point in the next couple of days. So we'll see how that pans out. You'll probably hear me talk about that in the coming weeks and months. But as far as it pertains to the art of debate, the reason why I think this idea is asinine, and the reason why I worry, and the reason why I believe that I've taken on board this stance and I've listened, but I've still decided in my head that it's a stance not worth taking on board to a certain degree is this. The rhetoric that I've seen in both instances is anger-based. And yes, while anger can be a great motivator, it certainly doesn't promote clarity of thought, and it certainly inhibits people from making a decision that if they were presented with from a purely unbiased perspective, they might make a slightly different decision, or at least a slightly more conservative one. Wholesale change of a situation is not necessarily a guarantee that it changes for the better. Swapping power from one hand to another isn't a guarantee of positive change. Look at several historical instances where you get rid of, say, a dictator, and the idea is that you get rid of the dictator. Well, what happens? You have a power vacuum, a regime comes into force that isn't checked, that isn't regulated, has no history, and often ends up being worse than the original because there's no one to hold to account. There's no long-term goal. The oppression that was suffered is swapped for chaos and anarchy for no other reason than chaos and anarchy seems to be a preferential choice. Now, that's not to say that that's the best option. If you're talking about dictators and things like that, I don't think there's a really proven way of taking them down in a positive way, unfortunately. It's a sad side effect of people yearning for power. Going off on a bit of a tangent here, but to bring it back, the reason why I relate the two is this. In these debates, I don't have a dog in the fight, as I've said before. That doesn't mean it discounts my opinion, because it means I still can look at things from a logical perspective, take all the things into the equation and look at the long-term benefits or side effects for what people might be suggesting. With the transgender debate, it wasn't that people shouldn't have rights or shouldn't be allowed to participate or that representation wasn't important. It was the sacrifice of my choice as a producer or a content creator to have a idea for a transgendered movie or television show and have the right to choose whoever I want, irrespective of their backgrounds. The idea that representation trumps that, I find, is a bit disconcerting, because if you the fact that it's applied by Hollywood and other places, it disappoints me when people think that the adequate response to oppression is oppression. The adequate response to misrepresentation is to overrepresent. It's an odd situation we find ourselves in, where the overcompensation is a problem to me. But why do I bring up the listening part? Well, over these conversations, I've come to realise that perhaps my aggressive views have been built over the last couple of weeks in an attempt to try and combat the aggressive views of others. Meaning that I've been a hypocrite from that perspective of saying, look, maybe you need to listen. Maybe you need to review your standpoint and your policies. Maybe you need to let a better argument trump a worse one. I was especially disappointed with the Scarlett Johansson situation, not necessarily because it's Scarlett Johansson, I couldn't give a toss whoever it was, but the fact that she was effectively bullied out of a role was very disappointing to me. And the fact that the transgender community saw this as a victory, I can see their perspective, but I also disagree with the means with which they achieved their goal. And I feel that if we'd have applied that same tactic to something like the NRA, we'd all be condemning it because of the long-term ramifications of that result. Bully tactics won. It's the same reason why I have an issue with Scientology having gotten the religious status, considering that they launched a tirade of abuse at the IRS, got their way, and I think we can all agree that wasn't necessarily a good idea. Nuanced argument has to win, and the only way that nuanced argument can win is when people have the maturity and the ability to be able to admit when they're wrong, and to be able to admit and cede points without worrying that they're going to lose their stance on a situation. I feel like people think that if they give an inch, or if they give part of their argument up, that means that they lose the argument entirely, they lose credibility. And yes, that's probably true to a certain extent, but it certainly doesn't mean you lose altogether. So what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way on this podcast, and this particularly short podcast, is this. I can admit at least that over the previous weeks, and maybe in the coming weeks too, in my attempts to try and change minds and to confront ideas that I think are asinine or overly aggressive or formed from an illogical perspective or basis, I may be overly aggressive at times, but I will make a conceded effort to try and to at least take on board the perspective of the other person and what they're trying to achieve. In some instances, unfortunately, there are going to be situations where people are just too dumb to actually have that point of view. I don't think I'm out of turn for saying that. There's going to be people who take sides for the sake of just being on a team, and that's fine. And that's why I often struggle, because I straddle lines occasionally. I don't like being on team transgender or team anti-transgender, because there's things I'm going to agree with on both sides. Yes, I believe, for instance, in equal representation, and I believe in equal rights, but I also disagree with bullying, and I also disagree with creative inhibition, and you telling me what I can and can't do and what I can and can't say, and more importantly, using terminology, phrases and words that you've created in an attempt to bully me out of the sphere of conversation. It's the same with the disabled debate in terms of representation. Yes, it's woefully underrepresented, and oftentimes the character has to be almost tragic in their portrayal, which again I think is hard for people to digest, because oftentimes disability does come with an innate amount of suffering, which people don't want to confront or don't want to accept. This comes from someone who has to see one of their loved ones. I wouldn't think it's too far a stretch to say that they suffer on a regular basis with some form of disability, and you have to try and find the silver lining in that, and that's not easy to do. And Hollywood producers and television producers, music producers, any artistic producer needs to find ways of tackling that in their own head and getting over their prejudices. I think the UFC fight that's being allowed to fight soon is an excellent example of us getting over our prejudices. I understand the viewpoint of people saying, well, safety-wise, maybe that's a bad choice, but his record speaks for itself. He's a talented UFC fighter. It would only be your prejudice at that point saying, well, we shouldn't give him an opportunity because, well, he's disabled, that I would then have a problem with. If you have a genuine, legitimate piece of evidence that proves that he is going to get hurt, then fair enough. But otherwise, you need to give everyone the same opportunities if they've earned the right, and clearly he's earned the right to compete. So more power to him, and I hope he does exceptionally well. And I hope the people that fight him give him the due respect he deserves for stepping in the octagon the same way that they have, because they're in the same situation. They could be knocked out, choked out, just like he can. So it's not like it's an uneven playing field in the sense of the outcome. It's just that they would have a slight physical advantage in that they have all their appendages. So it'd be interesting to see how that one plays out and see the opportunities he's afforded down the line, and I hope he's tremendously successful. But to bring it back to the point, people, here's what I would leave you with. Try and be better than me. The next time you're having a disagreement with someone, make a concerted effort to understand their viewpoint first. What is their goal? What are they trying to achieve? What set them out in the first place? What are their points? What's their evidence? And how does that conflate with your sensibilities? Is it a particular point that you take issue with? Are you able to cede that at all? If not, are they able to cede their point to you in order to then get you both back on side and have a consensus? You never know. It'd be better for everyone to get along and maybe not necessarily agree with everything than to take sides and not cede any points whatsoever, because then the narrative, the point, the idea, the social progression that we're trying to achieve doesn't happen at all. So I'm going to bring this episode of the Veracious Show to a close. I'm really appreciative of anyone that's listened to the show over the last couple of weeks. Appreciate you listening to this podcast. I hope you check out the shows that come forward. Apologies that this one is late. Like I said, I've been producing content for Halcyon, which I'm hoping you also check out as well. Check out some of the other content creators in the description below. Stay tuned for the next episode that will drop next week. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. I hope you're not getting into as many arguments and silly little quarrels as me. I hope you, like I say, taking care of yourselves. I'll see you guys on the next episode of The Veracious Show.